This is a product that I've been testing out for a long time now, and in this episode I'm going over my review, namely the pros and cons. I have already filmed a first look at this tent where I went over every single component. I went over all the stats, all of that stuff. While I will touch upon the stats real quick, there's going to be some information left behind that you will find in the first look, the preview. The focus of this episode is primarily on the review, the pros and cons of this tent. My name is Luke, this is the Outdoor Gear Review. Let's get to it. Before we really get into the review of this tent, let's talk about what this is. This is a one-person pop-up style instant setup tent. Basically, you take it out of the bag, you lock the frame into place, and the tent is set up. That aspect is very, very impressive. Now, unfortunately, it's all of the other aspects of this tent that really hold it back. This is the one-person model, but there is a two-person version of this tent. Unfortunately, there's a big difference between the one-person and the two-person, namely in regards to materials. Let's go ahead and talk about those real quick. When it comes to the one-person version, this is a silicone-treated 20 denier nylon. It's a ripstop, and it features a 70 denier ripstop nylon floor. The two-person version, check this out. It's made from a 210T polyester, and the floor is a 19T polyester. In other words, we have higher end materials here. We have the two-person version that uses very inexpensive, less advanced materials. The question you may be asking yourself is, why did the company do this? It's all about cost. With the two-person version, it's larger, you need more material, so they went a cheaper route. In other words, they were keeping the price down. But in doing so, the weight shot up big time. The one-person version, 3.3 pounds. The two-person version is 7.2 pounds. That's substantial. Both tents feature the exact same pole system, and that's made from fiberglass and plastic. And both tents feature the same hydrostatic head rating, which is 2,000 millimeters. This is how easy it is to set up this tent. You separate the components, you pull out the tent body. Now watch this. And just like that, the tent is set up. Now all you have to do is stake it out, namely at the front of the tent with the door and the back side. Naturally, if you want the tautest pitch, go ahead and stake out the entire tent, putting one stake in each corner. As you all can see, the tent sets up in no time at all. I mean, like 15 seconds, it's done. To set up the tent, you have 6 tent stakes. 1 at the door, 1 at the back, and then 4 for the corners. That's all of the tent stakes that you get. You may be wondering, what about guy lines? Unfortunately, this tent has none. It includes none. There's no placement for any. The company says that the tent comes with 6 guy lines pre-attached. The thing is this, all of them are attached at the bottom of the tent. There's none for the top of the tent. This poses a big problem, and I'll talk more about this in just a minute. You may be looking at the front of the tent and you see a loop here and a loop over there. Those are for tying back the doors. Those are not guy line points. These are not points that you want to put any sort of stress on because they're not reinforced. You do that, you put force on them, you put stress on them, and they could leak. When it comes to this tent, the company made a lot of odd decisions, all of which we will get to in just a moment. So with the one-person tent, you have one door. This is one entry point. You have one vestibule that's usable. You do have another vestibule on the other side, but you cannot access it from the inside of the tent. This is the only vestibule that you can use. Now we're looking at the front of the tent with the doors pulled back. You can see the inner. We have mesh here, we have fabric here, we have a bathtub floor here. The tent itself is covered in a ton of fabric, and unfortunately that presents big problems. We have this strip of fabric that goes all the way around this tent, and then we have mesh above it. This type of fabric is good for 4th season tents, namely tents that keep you warm. They block out wind. Fabric material in a 3-season tent makes no sense at all. The reason why the company went with this is because of cost. Fabric is less expensive than mesh, which is surprising, right? Let me explain to you all what this does. This fabric prevents airflow from coming inside of the tent. So when you're inside of this fabric is holding in heat. It's blocking airflow, even though you have this mesh here. With this tent fully staked out, airflow's coming in, it's hitting this wall, this fabric here, and it's not going inside of the tent. It's not cooling you off. So we have an interesting situation with this product. It's a 3-season tent that is too warm, too hot to use in the summertime. With my testing, I'm comfortable in this tent around 55 degrees and below. Anything above that, and it's just simply too hot. Yes, you do have the mesh here, you have the mesh that goes around the tent, but that's not enough. It doesn't release enough heat, and it doesn't allow for enough airflow to come inside of the tent. Getting inside of the tent is nice and easy because this tent is tall and the doorway is really, really wide. You do have a rather aggressive bathtub floor, but it's not too bad. So you can hop inside of this very easily. That presents the next big problem with this tent. It is narrow. You may not be able to tell it right now because the door's open, but my arm is pushing against this wall and my other arm and leg is sticking out of this door here. So when it's all zipped up, you're inside of the inner here. It's tall, it's not very long, and it's also not very wide. I just happen to have my tape measure with me, so let's go ahead and measure this real quick. So you're looking at roughly 23 inches wide. I mean, think about that, 23 inches. That's incredibly narrow. As far as the height goes, the peak height, right at 39 inches. As far as the length goes, lengthwise, we're looking at roughly 6 feet. That has you basically with your head all the way back, and that's going to have your sleeping bag touching the wall here. So in truth, someone who is 6 foot could get this to work, but I would personally recommend this for individuals around 5'8" and below. Right? That's going to give you maximum space in here that won't result in your sleeping bag getting soaking wet by morning. Because this tent is surrounded in that fabric material, condensation will form on it. It's something that you have to be thoughtful, mindful of. Speaking of the fabric, it goes around the inside of the tent, all the way across the top. You do have some mesh here and there. You have a small triangle here, another one over here. You have a few panels on this side, and additionally, you have the door. Let's take a second here and let's talk about price. When I put up my preview, this tent was selling for $155. At the time of filming now, the one person is $140. The two-person version was $160, but it's now going for $140. Already I've begun talking about some of the cons with this tent, and I wanted to mention those primarily because they're such a big deal when it comes to this shelter. Now I'm going to start with the primary review, namely with the pros, and then we'll go to the cons. The pro list for this tent is very short. So right off the bat, the materials are good. We're talking about a silicone treated nylon that's a higher end material. It's lightweight. After spending quite a bit of time with this tent, looking it over very carefully, this is a very good quality shelter. There's no issues when it comes to the construction. There's no issues when it comes to the threads, the seam taping, nothing like that. So it's very well made. The setup process for this tent is unlike any other that I've seen before. It is the easiest, the quickest setup I've ever seen. Continuing on with the pros, with my testing, this tent has been 100% waterproof. Even in heavy downpours that have lasted numerous hours, this tent has not leaked. I like the fact that the tent is tall and also the door is rather large. It's easy to get inside and out of this tent. Additionally, I have to say that I like the overall color scheme of this tent. I like the way that it looks. It's a very slick looking tent. In fact, it looks somewhat tactical. And that takes us over to the last pro that I have for this tent, and that is cost. $140 for a one-person tent with these materials and that instant pop-up frame. That's not bad. That's not bad at all. Now everyone, let's go over to the cons where the list is much longer. So right off the bat, we talked about the fabric that surrounds the inner of the tent. It makes no sense for a 3-season tent. This tent is just super, super hot. When you're inside of this, even at 60 degrees, it's rather warm. So you have that fabric, it's holding in heat, it's blocking air. Yes, there is some mesh, it does help, but it really takes a strong wind gust to get up that high inside of this tent. So even at like 60 degrees, I find myself opening up the door because it's just simply too warm in there. In the cooler months, this is going to work well, but for at least myself, it's got to be in conditions around 55 degrees and cooler to be comfortable. Because this tent is so small, you're so close to the walls, to the material, condensation is an issue. It does form quite badly inside of this shelter. The airflow inside of this tent is limited, and that only makes the issue with condensation that much worse. With the one-person tent that you see here, the weight is not bad. In my opinion, it makes sense considering the fact that this features a pop-up frame. With the two-person version, this is a big con because that tent is super heavy. It's over 7 pounds, and that's too much for a two-person tent. Or at least in my opinion. I'm not willing to carry that much weight for a two-person tent. If you're car camping, no big deal. If you're out backpacking camping, it is a big deal. What makes the two-person version so heavy is the fact that the company went with an inexpensive polyester material. There is a pro to that inexpensive polyester, and that's the fact that it doesn't stretch all that much. Whereas with the silicone-treated nylon, it does stretch, it does sag, and that is a con for this tent. When you're inside of this tent, condensation's forming on the walls, maybe it's raining outside, the material begins to sag. And that basically means that the material is getting even closer and closer to the inner, closer and closer to you. Your body heat is heating that up, the cool air outside, that's forming condensation. It's just an issue for this tent, unfortunately. And at the same time, as the materials are sagging, the vestibule is getting smaller and smaller because it's sagging, it's coming in. When you go to set up this tent initially, you have quite a bit of space underneath that vestibule. But over time, that vestibule is getting smaller and smaller, and you're going to have to make adjustments to it. Otherwise, in breezy conditions, you'll hear flap, 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 and that's because the material has stretched. And that's just one of the traits when it comes to silicone-treated nylon. Talking about using this tent in the wind, because there's no guy lines on top of this tent, it poses a problem. Yes, the tent is anchored down at the bottom, but there's nothing at the top. So in windy conditions, this tent can be a handful. It can be very difficult to sleep in it because it's just nonstop shaking, rocking back and forth. And again, it's because there's no way to anchor the top of the tent to the ground. The guy lines that are at the bottom, they're really long, and apparently that's for use with some sort of cot system, something that I've never seen before. In general, this is just a bad idea. It's a bad design. And that pretty much summarizes my review for this tent. There's just so much about this that is just poorly thought out, poorly designed. And what frustrates me the most, to summarize here, is what this tent could have been, right? This tent is right on the verge of being something special. But as it is right now, in my opinion, don't buy it. It's a no-go. If the company was to make the inner just a little bit wider, if the company was to make the tent just a little bit longer, if the company was to get rid of those guy lines down at the bottom and put them on top where they belong, that would make so much more sense. At the same time, the company needs to get rid of all of this fabric and replace it with mesh. Allow airflow to go inside of the tent. These little changes would make this tent fantastic. But as it is right now, even though there's something I like about this shelter, I cannot recommend it. I really can't. The way that it sets up so easily, so quickly is unlike anything I've ever seen before. I mean, it truly is special. It truly is amazing. But that alone is not enough to justify buying this tent. It simply has too many shortcomings that are going to be big problems. And that, my friends, wraps up my review of the NatureHike Canyon tent. What a shame, you know? What a shame. There's just so much about this tent that just doesn't make any sense to me. It's one of those things where, like, NatureHike should know better. They've made enough tents. They should know what they're doing. But there's just so much to this that just leaves me, like, scratching my head because it makes no sense. Hopefully NatureHike will see this episode. I will share it with them. Hopefully the designers can listen to what I'm saying here. Consider it. Do what you want to. But hopefully they can re-release this product and it could be truly special. Not everybody needs an ultralight tent, right? But everybody loves convenience. You know what I mean? Being comfortable and convenience are two really good aspects to a shelter, in addition to it protecting you from the elements. So if the company can make some changes, right? Make this more comfortable, make this more usable for summertime use, they will have a hit on their hands, even if that means raising the price some. In my opinion, having a low cost in every situation is not a winning factor. But hey, what do I know? I just review gear, I don't make it, I don't sell it. If you found this episode helpful, useful, hit the thumbs up, I do appreciate it. Everyone, take care, be well, strength and honor. On to the next product to review. Oh yeah. Bye folks.